We're going to start our exploration of U.S. history with the story of pre-Columbian Native Americans, or more simply, Native American history before 1492. If you look at our AP U.S. history course, it begins in 1491. This is significant because we need to recognize that the history of America does not begin with Columbus or his discovery of the New World. In fact, Columbus didn't discover America at all. Rather, he connected two worlds that had previously been separated. At the time that Columbus set sail across the Atlantic in 1492, modern historians have estimated that the indigenous people of the Americas had built empires which sustained between 60 million people, and in some cases, some historians believe as many as 100 million people. In comparison, the population of Europe at this time period in 1492 was between about 70 and 88 million. So as you can see, Columbus was not stepping into an untouched land like sometimes we're told in the past, but rather a land already occupied by over 500 nations, speaking over 375 distinct languages. So the Americas were the last continents populated by human beings. Most historians believe that the earliest people in the Americas migrated from Siberia into Alaska and then over time spread southward overland and along the west coast. Paleo Indians, as they're sometimes called, migrated further south in search of big game and new sources of food. And most historians believe this occurred about 15,000 years ago as the earth was warming up after its last ice age. These Paleo Indians found in North America a vast, cool grassland that sustained large herds of slow-moving herbivores, many of which are extinct today. Now, this abundant food source allowed an explosion in their population, which sometimes placed a strain on local resources. As a result, as bands of Paleo Indians, as I said they were called, grew too large, then they would subdivide, and these groups would move into new areas. Over the course of thousands of years, this led to the spread of Native Americans to all parts of the Americas, and it led to essentially the populating of the American continents as we kind of think of them today. It also led to the creation of distinct tribes throughout the Americas. As Native Americans adapted to the resources of their environment, they developed different strategies for providing for themselves, as well as their own unique cultures with distinct languages, rituals, stories, etc. This explains the differences between native tribes in, say, the Pacific Northwest, where there was an abundance of rainfall and game to hunt, versus tribes of the Southwest, where the climate was dry and arid. So that kind of takes us to another misconception about Native Americans, which is their impact on the environment around them. One of the biggest myths surrounding Native Americans was that they did not change the environment around them and that they had very little impact on the Americas prior to the arrival of Europeans. This assumption is flat out wrong. The earliest inhabitants of the Americas were hunters and gatherers. Not only did the hunting activities of early inhabitants of the Americas affect the population of animals such as mammoths and giant bison, but they also actively changed the environment in order to promote the growth of edible plants and improve hunting conditions. For example, Native Americans would set annual fires to forests in order to destroy underbrush and small trees. This increased the deer population for hunting and made room for edible plants such as wild onions and sunflowers. As farming began to emerge, Native Americans developed irrigation systems in order to sustain crops. Therefore, we can conclude that Native Americans did put pressure on their environment and in some cases did damage to the environment. However, it's important to note that they did significantly less damage than the Europeans who would begin to colonize the Americas in 1492. So that takes us to horticulture. Perhaps one of the areas where Native Americans were most advanced was in their cultivation of various crops. Indeed, we owe the inclusion of tomatoes, corn, beans, squash, and even potatoes in European cuisine to Native American agriculture. Over many generations, farming developed within Native American societies, in addition to hunting and gathering. The Indians of central Mexico are the ones that first pioneered the great three crops of American farming: squash, beans, and maize, which we also refer to as corn. Together, these three crops, which were often planted alongside one another, were referred to as the Three Sisters. Of those crops, maize or corn cultivation was especially important. Maize cultivation led to large increases in population and permanent villages everywhere it spread to. In fact, the spread of maize cultivation from present day Mexico northward into the American Southwest and beyond supported economic development and social diversification among societies. In other words, where maize went, obviously those societies got bigger and more complex. Some examples of this, starting in central Mexico, was the Aztec. The Aztec developed complex methods of crop cultivation, such as terrace agriculture, irrigation farming, and complex canal systems. As corn or maize cultivation spread northward, it made its way into the Southwest. And we see this with the Pueblo. Now, the Pueblo people began planting corn around 2000 BC. The Pueblo, who made their home in the Southwest, developed complex irrigation systems in order to support and maintain their crops. They also built large pueblos or huge sandstone block and adobe buildings into the sides of cliffs and canyons. The largest pueblo is located at Chaco Canyon, and it can still be seen today. The Mississippian culture, which is located in, say, the Midwest along the Mississippi River, also adopted maize cultivation. The largest town within the Mississippian culture was that of Cahokia, which was located in present-day Illinois, just east of St. Louis. At its height, Cahokia had a population between 10,000 and 30,000 people, a population that would rival that of medieval London. Maize cultivation made Cahokia a center of trade and led to the creation of a complex society, which today is best remembered for the massive mounds that we can still see even 500 years later. As part of their civilization, they created these huge earthen structures, the largest of which stood over 10 stories high. So, in other words, to recap, everywhere maize was planted, it began to transform Native Americans and native cultures from nomadic tribes or hunter-gatherer societies into settled agricultural villages. It is important to note, though, that this process occurred slowly and unevenly, which is why not every Native American tribe was the same. In some cases, Native American tribes just flat out did not adopt maize cultivation. Okay, so that takes us to Native American beliefs. Contrary to the beliefs of the first European explorers in the Americas, Native Americans did have developed religious views and rituals. In general, many historians describe Native American beliefs as the concept of animism. Native Americans believed that there was a strong connection between the natural world and the supernatural. In the view of many Native American peoples, all things belong to a complex web of both spiritual and material. In other words, spiritual power inhabited everything around them, from the plants to the animals, the rocks, the wind, the water. This is very, very different from the dominant European religions at the exact same time, which emphasizes a clear distinction between the spiritual world and the material world. Additionally, Europeans often believed that it was their divine duty, their divine right by God to conquer nature and tame the land. And that belief would create significant conflict once these two worlds are going to collide after 1492. So ultimately, the native populations of the Americas were very diverse. They spoke many different languages and practiced different forms of the animism that I just talked about. Native American tribes developed differently as a result of their environment. It also means that they were not, and this is such an important concept, they were not a unified group when Europeans arrived. As a result, each Native American group would interact with Europeans differently after 1492. Topics that we're going to explore further as we get deeper into period one. I'm going to throw it over now to Miss Ulrich, who's going to talk a little bit about the Columbian Exchange. Take care.